Okay, well, in the interest of kicking off in time, thank you so much, everybody, for joining us today for Bridging the Price Gap for Sustainable Aviation Fuel, our report launch, and also our Q&A panel session that we're running alongside with that. I'd like to begin today by acknowledging the Ngunnawal people, the traditional custodians of the land on which I'm in today, and paying my respects to their elders past and present. And I'd like to extend that respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Island peoples who are on the call, and also from those regions where everybody attending is coming from. Bioenergy Australia is the industry association charged with creating Australia's future bioeconomy. And one really significant key part of that for us is sustainable aviation fuel and the significant opportunity that that presents, not only for emissions reduction, but for job creation in regional Australia, for fuel security, for investing here in Australia, and really creating new industries for the future. We have, as one of those things, created something called the Sustainable Aviation Fuel Alliance of Australia and New Zealand. And we have a fantastic set of members ranging from airlines to airports to fuel suppliers, state government representatives and the like, participating across that, supporting us in seeking to advance this industry moving forward in Australia. This particular report, as I said, that the name of the report was commissioned by Bioenergy Australia through the Sustainable Aviation Fuel Alliance. And it was really around us trying to take the information that came out of the bioenergy roadmap that showed aviation was a hard to abate sector that needed focus and deliberate attention in order to really be able to create this industry. And so it showed some significant things in relation to what SAF could deliver, but I'll leave probably some of those points for our speakers that will be speaking a little bit further down. But what we decided to do was to commission this report to show, okay, so now we know this is a really hard to abate sector. We know that this is a sector that needs support. Now, what do we actually need to do to accelerate and make it happen? So this report has really been designed to give us the pathway forward in now driving this industry forward, and you'll see some of the recommendations that have come out of that. In relation to today, if you would like to participate and provide questions, we would love that. So you can pop those in the Q&A or the chat down at the bottom, and Heidi will be managing all of the Q&A and the panel associated with this particular session. I would now like to introduce Heidi Heifer, who is the chair of our Sustainable Aviation Fuel Alliance for Australia and New Zealand. She is the Regional Sustainability Lead for Australia and New Zealand of Boeing, and she is going to be leading this session for us today. So thank you so much, Heidi, and thank you to our speakers today. Oh, and I should say a really big thank you to the team from Energy Link Services who delivered this report for us. It has been a bit of a mammoth effort to pull this thing together, and we've really appreciated the incredible approach that they've taken. So thank you so much. Over to you, Heidi.
Thank you so much, Shahana. I am really excited that we have this group of people here with us to learn a little bit more about the report and then reflect on some of the recommendations. And before I hand over to Michael to give us a run through of the highlights from the report, I just wanted to firstly say thanks to Bioenergy Australia and to Shahana in particular for hosting this really important group. Shahana gave you a little bit of an insight into this group, the Sustainable Aviation Fuel Alliance. I think it's important to understand the purpose of this cross-industry, really collaborative group. So I'm just going to reiterate the purpose of the group before handing over to Michael. So we exist to accelerate the development of the SAF as a new industry in Australia and New Zealand. We see it creating jobs and benefits for the Australian and New Zealand economies. To increase the availability of commercially viable and environmentally sustainable supply of low carbon fuels for aviation in Australia and New Zealand, and to see the implementation of the right environment to foster this. So that's policy settings and market incentives, and that leads us very nicely into the commissioning of the report and in hearing a bit more from Michael. So Michael Hallam is going to take us through, one of the co-authors of the report. Michael is a consulting engineer at Energy Link Services. And I am going to hand over to you now, Michael, to take us through a bit of a highlight.
Fantastic. Thanks, Heidi. I'm just going to share my screen. If you just give me one moment. But can you just, Heidi, can you confirm that you can see my screen in the presentation?
I can.
So yeah, a big thank you to Heidi for the introduction and to Shahana for first off engaging us and all the work she's been doing in advancing the SAF agenda historically and will continue to do moving forward, and also for organising this webinar and allowing us to present the report that we authored titled Bridging the Price Gap for Sustainable Aviation Fuel, or SAF. So just to give you a little bit of an overview in terms of what the actual report pertains to and what we did. So the report was commissioned because SAF currently can be up to 10 times the price of traditional Jet A1 or fossil-based aviation fuel. And there's an enormous interest in uptaking SAF, but there isn't really a clear plan on how we actually get there and what actions we can take today to help drive that uptake. So we did a review of international policy covering, Europe, the UK, the US, and a case study on New Zealand to help understand what's been done globally, what's worked, what hasn't, what are the best practice policy mechanisms. And then we did some extensive stakeholder consultation, and that covered the full supply chain of traditional and sustainable aviation fuels. So your SAF producers, traditional fuel producers, fuel infrastructure operators, airports, airlines, airplane OEMs, and various levels of government, just to see what their thoughts were, what we'd found, and present those findings and what we thought the recommendation should be and get their thoughts, and also understand what are the other issues and barriers that are faced in terms of integrating SAF into the market that aren't just price. And finally, the final step, we produced some recommendations, of which there's 4, and I'll run through those shortly as part of this presentation. So just to give you a little bit of background in terms of the actual international findings and what we've seen happening globally, and this is obviously a very short excerpt, there's far more detail in the report. But in effect, there are a number of jurisdictions, including the EU, the UK, that have got blending mandates for SAF, or they're looking to implement those kind of mandates. And they're trying to dial up the proportion of SAF that would be integrated into the aviation fuel mix. The UK also did something, and we think is quite profound, in establishing a Jet Zero Council, which is effectively a body to cover all of the various stakeholders and bring together those findings. And we actually made a similar recommendation for Australia. And we'll touch on that shortly. And there's also the US. The US is always a fun one because there's 51 states and they all kind of do their own thing, as well as the federal government. So there's the Federal Renewable Fuel Standard, which provides a financial incentive that includes SAF and a number of other fuels. There is a tax credit that exists for SAF production, and also California, which is known for having its Low Carbon Fuel Standard, or LCFS, which is one of the most established, long-running and highly regarded programs for reducing transport emissions, and that's across the full gamut of transport modes, including aviation. So those are the sorts of programs that we looked at and we dived into to understand what we can do, what worked, what didn't work, and the pros and cons of each. And obviously, given our close neighbour New Zealand has a very, very similar market to us, and they're also deeply engaged with what happens with SAF, and they've produced their own roadmap. And it is a great document, and it's really, really important because it does have a number of the key players in the aviation space involved in that consortium, so particularly Air New Zealand. And it really is important, particularly where you are looking at blending mandates or trying to drive SAF into the supply system, that you do have buy-in from the key players, being the airlines, just to make sure that there is full consultation, full transparency. They know what's coming and they're on board with it. When we spoke to all of the various airlines as part of our stakeholder consultation, the overwhelming response was, we are interested at SAF if the economics are at the right price. And so it really is about trying to scale up the industry, trying to come down the cost curve so that airlines can adopt SAF without catastrophically impacting their bottom line. And the roadmap that was put out in New Zealand, it identified a couple of key actions, and one of which was the establishment of a Jet Zero Council, similar to the UK, and also a recommendation that we came to as well, and also looking at a SAF blending mandate. And so you can see in this graph here that they've also mapped out kind of a pathway and different plant types that they might look at out to 2050. Our report sits a little bit higher level, more on the policy mechanisms rather than diving into the different types of plants and what you may be able to technically do. But you can see kind of out to 2030, it's in 2035, 2040, a lot of it is traditional plants that already exist. The technology that's being used, alcohol to jet, gasification type systems, they're already here. They're things we can do now. It's just about scale. Out to 2050 and looking towards that 50% blending, there are assumptions around other types of technologies, power to jet type synthetic fuels and things like that, which aren't quite at that commercial scale. But if you don't create the market, it's much, much harder to get those up to speed. So we kind of drew quite a lot on New Zealand and the work that they've done there, just given the similarities between Australia and New Zealand as well. So in terms of the recommendations, as I said, we made 4 recommendations, the first being establishing a jet council, second, looking at a national framework for voluntary consumer purchases, the third, looking at dedicated funding mechanisms for SAF, and the fourth being an emissions intensity mandate. So diving straight in, so the first recommendation around establishing a jet council. So this is following the lead of the UK government, who've got one that's up and running, and also looking to follow in the footsteps of what's been suggested over in New Zealand. But it really is about bringing together the relevant government and industry stakeholders to provide advice on SAF policy, look at how research and development activities are going on within Australia, what opportunities are there to further those and overcome any of the existing barriers. I think it's quite clear that Australia does have a natural competitive advantage when it comes to these kinds of fuels, and it really just needs a level of coordination that traditional government policy mechanisms aren't that well suited to. So we think having a dedicated body to engage directly with the government, provide feedback effectively in real time, and provide their opinions is incredibly valuable. We also think there's a role for the Jet Council in the implementation of the voluntary purchasing program, and that may be in consultation with the government or alongside a government department or instead of. It's really agnostic, but we think that that is one of the key recommendations and something that can be done effectively today to set up the future for SAF development in Australia. So the second recommendation does look at a national framework for voluntary consumer purchasing, and this is really about trying to show and allow people to take action where they want to. One of the key issues around SAF and the price difference is that it does become more expensive, and so there is an equity question in terms of who pays for those costs and who bears them. And if you have a voluntary scheme, then it's only those who are willing to pay who are going to bear those additional costs. And I'll touch on those additional costs in the next slide, but we think the best way of doing this is a guarantee of origin or a GUO type scheme, where you're creating certificates that correspond to the volume of SAF that's been sold and put into the fuel supply chain. This mimics the type of guarantee of origin programs we've seen in the renewable energy industry under the renewable energy target, albeit they serve a slightly different purpose, and what's currently being worked on for hydrogen and also for green gas. And it really just allows robust, transparent reporting of emissions reductions and allows airlines to make the right claims to say that they have bought SAF. One of the key challenges is that when you put SAF into the fuel infrastructure within an airport, it just gets blended with all of the other aviation fuel. You can't track individual molecules of SAF into a plane wing. So if one of the airlines, say Qantas, buys SAF, they would just be buying and receiving fuel through the airline infrastructure. There's no way for them to dedicate and say, well, we put this in and that's ours, unless there's a certificate mechanism that exists that allows you to do that. And then it does also allow you to integrate with ENGA reporting, which is the National Greenhouse and Energy Reporting Framework, which is really Australia's compliance reporting, so that those airlines that are doing the right thing and they are buying SAF can receive the acknowledgement and publicly show that that's what they're doing. And the reason we see this being quite important is it does allow you to interact directly with customers to voluntarily opt in. So in the same way, currently, if you book a flight, you have the option to offset your emissions. This is looking to do the same thing, but reduce them before you offset. So it's just another way of kind of engaging with your customers, many of which have, in the business sense, net zero ambitions and the like, and giving them an opportunity to help reduce their emissions rather than just offsetting those emissions. And so what sort of cost does it look like? Obviously costs change as the industry scales. So at the current upper end of what SAF might cost, it is a little bit expensive, but the intention is we want to create sufficient demand and establish the supply chain so that you can start to come down the cost curve. As you can see in the table below, at twice the price of jet fuel, the additional cost per passenger kilometre or for a trip from Sydney to Melbourne is actually quite small. And so this allows those that are willing to pay to say, yep, I'm happy to pay the extra, say $36 to fly to Melbourne, because I know that the benefits and I'm effectively paying to bring down the cost of SAF in the long term. And as I said before, this avoids a scenario where everyone has to pay and there's a disproportionate impact to, say, low income earners or something like that, and really delivers quite an equitable outcome. We also see a really big opportunity to leverage corporate buyers clubs to generate the demand. And the Rocky Mountain Institute out of the US have created a buyers club over there, which is, you know, large corporates who fly a lot, typically your tech companies, your big consultancies, government departments, and probably in Australia you'd put the resource companies in the same boat. Opportunities for them to all band together and commit to buying SAF to provide a minimum level of demand. And that level of demand should be enough to get the first refinery built in Australia. And once you get the first refinery built and you start scaling out, the cost starts to come down. As it gets cheaper and cheaper, becomes more and more economic for more participants to engage in buyers clubs and voluntarily opt in, which means you scale further and you just keep kind of in a virtuous cycle, moving down the cost curve and advancing the industry within Australia. So we see this as one of the key elements to get things going. And again, it's something that can be done relatively quickly because you're not placing a compliance obligation on anyone. You're just doing it all in a voluntary sense. So there are no real losers because everyone who wants to participate can, and those that don't, they don't have to participate. So the third recommendation is around funding. I should say here, this isn't a kind of a pitch for just a blank check for the government or someone like that to basically pay for everything around a refinery. It is just around strengthening the commercial attractiveness of getting involved in those refineries and helping to kind of de-risk the first set of refineries to be built in Australia. And we see two options here. You can go down the capital grants pathway. So this is, you know, targeting the capital cost side of the proposal, strengthening the attractiveness of getting involved. And there are existing government bodies they're already doing this type of action, not necessarily in the SAF space, but they have the capability and the expertise to do that. There's the NAF, the EFA, ARENA, or the CEFC. And really the intention here is to try and mimic what was done in the renewable energy industry. And they estimate that the programs that were implemented and the funding provided helped bring forward the industry maturity by 5 years. The second option is around production-based subsidies. So this is targeting the operation revenues and the operating margins of a SAF refinery. And there's a couple of ways you can do this, one of which is to target and implement a scheme in the same way the fuel security services payments have been done for traditional fossil-based refineries in Australia. And in those systems, in essence, when the margin falls outside or falls below a certain amount, there's a government subsidy that kicks in. So when the refineries are operating very, very profitably, there's no subsidy paid. And when the refineries and the oil price is low enough that it's not actually really commercially viable for them, there's a government subsidy that kicks in. And the second option would be around a reverse auction type mechanism. We've seen these quite a bit in the electricity market. Notably, the ACT government ran a very large reverse auction a few years ago, and the UK government have run a number of reverse auctions for electricity. But this is effectively bidding your SAF pricing around a benchmark price, the benchmark being traditional aviation fuel or traditional Jet A1, and the government would effectively fund the difference between the proposed bid and the benchmark price. I've actually had a few conversations with major infrastructure financiers in preparing the report, and since the report's kind of been being reviewed, and there is quite a lot of demand for financiers to get involved. There are people who are keen to be involved, but it is that risk trade-off of the first refinery to be built and making sure that there is enough demand to warrant building a refinery in Australia, and be that if it's supplying the domestic market or the international market. But there really is, there's capital available. It's just building the right set of circumstances to allow that to be facilitated. And so the final recommendation that we made is an emissions intensity mandate. So this mimics the low carbon fuel standard out of California. So as you can see in this graph, effectively what happens is you create a fuel emissions intensity benchmark, which would be fossil-based Jet A1 fuel, and that has an intensity of 100. And over time, the emissions intensity is reduced, and fuels that have an emissions intensity below the benchmark create a credit, and fuels that have an emissions intensity above the benchmark create a deficit. And so there is a transfer of credits from fuels that are below, like SAF, to traditional Jet A1 users, and there's an extra financial incentive in place to help shift demand towards SAF. The graph here is from California, so the proposed emissions intensity is much, much slower, or the reduction in intensity is much, much slower than what's shown there, if you were looking at a SAF perspective. But we think there's a lot of merit in this type of program, and it would be, you know, a single overarching government program that would allow all SAF producers to participate, be it imported, domestically produced. And by placing the liability of credits at the point of fuel sold, you don't have to place a huge administrative burden on any airlines. You don't have to worry about exclusions or unfair advantages and the like for, you know, international airlines that have a small presence in Australia versus your domestic airlines. It helps ensure that everyone is covered and you're not placing a huge burden on the airlines. So in terms of what this would actually entail in the program design, we see there being kind of multiple phases. The initial phase looking at, you know, a 2.5% reduction in intensity by 2025. That is relatively soon, considering we are, you know, a quarter of the way through 2022. But you know, there's no reason that you can't use imports. Initially, it is really about just trying to get SAF into the system, overcome the logistical hurdles, the supply chain integration issues that are gonna happen, and really looking to kind of ramp that up over time. The one thing I will say here, and this was a common thread among stakeholder consultations, is trying to set a very, very high emissions intensity reduction, say for 2030. Like if you tried to do 50% by 2030, it's just not going to work. There isn't going to be the same level of buy-in from the key players in the industry, and the costs are much, much higher for doing things sooner. So, you know, we've tried to be mindful of that and keep the initial reductions low with a view to ramping up over time as the industry really does scale up and those costs come down, so you're not adversely kind of hitting the airlines right after COVID and breaking the business model. But we see the second phase, you know, from 2025 to 2030, you know, a very small increase to 3% emissions intensity reduction, and then it really starts to ramp up. So 3% to 10% over the next 10 years, and then heading up towards 50% out to 2050. We haven't modeled anything that goes above 50% as at the moment, and as it stands currently, SAF blends above 50% aren't actually certified under ASTM. That is in all likelihood going to change at some point in the future. And obviously you can change your emissions intensity reduction trajectories in the long term, you know, just to reflect the reality in industry and what's happening, what technologies are available, and what you can do in that space. The other good thing I would say about this type of program is because it is quite a small reduction required initially, and there are a number of countries that have quite aggressive ones. It does allow you to set up production in Australia and capitalize on those international markets. So Australia being an exporter of SAF and effectively getting other markets to pay for the cost reductions that come with scale. But we think there's an enormous opportunity, and as I said before, Australia does have a competitive advantage in this space, and particularly, you know, as technology changes and things move towards, you know, power to jet fuels and things like that. Australia and New Zealand, for that matter, have huge energy competitive advantages. New Zealand's got enormous hydro resources. Australia's got enormous renewable energy potential. So there really is an opportunity to become effectively the SAF capital of Southeast Asia and really supply the world with clean, sustainable aviation fuels rather than what we currently do with traditional fuels. Yeah, as I said before, a really big thank you to Heidi and a really big thank you to Shahana for giving me the opportunity to present the findings of our report. We're really, really pleased with the outcome. I'm more than happy to take any questions, and if we run out of time today, my contact details are there. More than happy to get in touch with anyone. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out. Thanks, Heidi. Do you want to
Michael, thank you.
from here?
Yeah, thank you so much. We'll definitely come back to you. I feel like there was, even for someone who's been involved in some of the report and read it multiple times, there's lots of questions already coming to me. I hope there's lots of questions from all of you listening in. We've got a great panel that I'm about to introduce that you can bounce ideas off as well. So please, there's a Q&A box, start adding some of your questions in there and I'll moderate those in just a moment. But back to Michael, I just wanted to, again, thank you and the other authors, which I neglected to mention earlier from Energy Link. So those being Philip Link and Sharon Maloba for this really great piece of work. So we have some great members from the Sustainable Aviation Fuel Alliance on the panel that I will introduce now. Each of us, including Michael on the panel, have done a lot of work in trying to work together to progress SAF and the environment for accelerating SAF. So really great expertise here for all of you online to tap into. So we're lucky enough to have Michael join the panel and stay on with us. He's going to be joined by Sami Jouhinainen from Neste. He's the Vice President for Asia Pacific for Renewable Aviation. Sami leads the sales and supply of sustainable aviation fuels in the Asia Pacific region for Neste. His focus is on growing awareness of SAF and supporting Neste customers in achieving their climate targets with SAF, and to establish supply chains to increase the availability of SAF in the Asia Pacific market. Sami is going to be joined by Celine Pal, who is head of fuels for Sydney Airport. And Celine currently manages the jet fuel business for Sydney Airport. She works on all aspects of jet fuel business, including the asset management, the management of commercial contracts, and the development of the aviation energy transition strategy. And we also have Graham Potger. Graham is head of Sustainable Aviation Fuel at Qantas. Graham is responsible for developing the Qantas Group's integrated SAF strategy, including its procurement approach, assessment of domestic investment opportunities, and assisting in the creation of a new SAF-related corporate and consumer propositions. His focus is on establishing the management of SAF as a new strategic capability within Qantas. So I hope you agree, we've got some great expertise here. I'm going to kick us off and then start taking a look in the Q&A channel for great questions from all of you. So please, a reminder to add in your questions. One of the things I'd like to get reflections from the panel on, if I may, is one of the things I like about the report is that the authors have recognised the Australian unique circumstances in Australia and New Zealand and the environment in which we live for these policy recommendations, but it's also taking learning from other parts of the world where perhaps they've been working on this for a bit longer or introduced policies ahead of us. So I was wondering if members of the panel would be happy to reflect on any of the SAF policies from Europe or North America that are referenced in the report and that we've heard a bit about from Michael on their effectiveness in driving investment and in SAF production in those regions. Do we have anyone from the panel willing to jump in?
Yeah, happy to start.
Thank you.
So I think if looking at the policy frameworks from SAF producer and investor point of view, what is the most important aspect is that they create this kind of a long-term demand certainty for the market, so that the market is there and then you can justify the business cases for high capital expenditure projects like building SAF capacities. And if you look at the policy frameworks, the most proven tool that we see applied in the aviation markets for sustainable aviation fuels, but similarly in the markets Europe and North America for road transportation biofuels, are the kind of mandate type of policies and regulations which fundamentally create the market for biofuels. Through that, they ensure the kind of realization of policy objectives, and then they stimulate the competition between technologies and producers of biofuels to fulfill the mandates in the most efficient way. So these have played a significant role in scaling up biofuel business and globally, and in sustainable aviation fuels. They are already in place in countries like Norway, Sweden, and France. European Union is likely to follow with a Europe-wide SAF mandate in 2025.
Thank you, Sami. That's an interesting perspective given a producer coming from a producer of sustainable aviation fuel. I wonder, as a customer or someone who's looking to purchase, Graham, what your observations are from North America and Europe, given recent announcements from Qantas for purchase of SAF in both regions, and how you see some of the policies in those parts of the world really helping you as someone who's trying to procure SAF.
Yeah, I think, Heidi, before we sort of embarked on our procurement journey, we sort of had to set some sort of fundamental principles, and I think will be no surprise to anyone in this audience, because airlines are such a margin-conscious business that, the cold, hard commercial reality is that we really need to optimize the cost of acquisition first and foremost. We're not a sector that can absorb massive cost overruns, which is part of our challenge and the premise of the report. So then it's probably then no surprise when you look at our first two SAF offtake deals that they happen in out of London Heathrow and out of California. So they are two subsidised jurisdictions, and I won't go into the details of each of those, but I think suffice to say that the nature of the subsidies differ in both those jurisdictions, but the net commercial end result is that it brings it from a cost perspective into our target range. And then the flip side of this is that we've also been doing a lot of work on how much of this SAF premium can we absorb, how much can we put through the voluntary type consumer products that Michael referred to in the report. So we've got a good sense of that, and there are limits to that from an airline perspective. So I think the proof is really in the pudding. If we can get this cost down, I think from a Qantas perspective, we're prepared to jump and take a leap of faith now, and that London and that California deal is really the proof point that we need on this.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. And Celine, I imagine there's some similarity there from your position at Sydney Airport, but interesting to see what you've seen, how you've seen the market influenced by these policies in North America and Europe from your point of view at the airport. Celine.
Celine, we just need you to unmute.
Can you hear me now?
We've got you now, Celine.
Right. Thanks, Heidi. Look, what I'm seeing is that everywhere where there's been some policies in place, so in Europe and North America, there's been SAF uptakes, and maybe small, but it is there and it is ramping up. Now, when it comes to Australia, the interest is there. In all the conversations that we have with the fuel suppliers and the airlines, SAF always comes up. So there's definitely interest and there is demand. The infrastructure is ready. SAF is a drop-in fuel, can use existing infrastructure, as Michael highlighted. At Sydney Airport, we've also introduced an open access framework. So there's no legal hurdles for a new entrant to come into Sydney Airport and use the infrastructure. So it really comes down to price. And that's where we really need those policies in place to help and also start the uptake in Australia. We're in very good position that we'll be able to see from other markets which policies work best. And I think therefore that JEC Council will be really helpful just to look at all these policies overseas and look at what works and what could be applied to the Australian markets in the most effective way.
Thanks everyone, and thanks Celine. And while I've got you, Celine, we might start taking some of the questions. They're coming in and into the Q&A box. So thanks everyone. Can you please keep them coming in? There's one specifically for you here from Andreas about the biggest barriers or challenges to making SAF available at the airport.
Look, there isn't actually. The main was just saying the main barrier is price. At the moment, the customers, the airlines can't make it stack up because of the price differential compared to conventional fuel. So there's still some misconceptions, and Michael touched on that in his presentation, that you don't need to duplicate the infrastructure at the airports to be able to throughput SAF. You can blend SAF with conventional fuel. And actually, the advice would be that you do not duplicate the infrastructure at the airport, because that would bring in additional costs, huge additional costs, which would make SAF even more expensive than it already is. So there isn't any barrier really. Some airports in Australia still have some lack of open access, but again, at Sydney Airport, we've introduced a framework which is open access, and we're still not seeing that uptake because it all comes down to price.
Yeah, thank you. So I think we'll jump up to Alan here. I've got a question from Alan about the one of the recommendations in the report, the voluntary consumer purchasing. And Alan asks, how does this system avoid the Freerider problem, where many people who could easily afford to pay extra cost elect not to pay the price premium? So maybe Michael, if you wanted to jump in and expand a bit on that.
Yeah, no worries. That's a great question, Alan. But I think ultimately, as the voluntary mechanism is a user pay system, by definition, there can't really be a free ride, in that only those that pay are the ones who will get the benefits. They may benefit longer term if it brings down the costs of SAF to the point where they're willing to participate. But ultimately, there is going to be some consumers who, irrespective of how low that premium is, are never going to want to pay a premium. So that's why we think it's best to target the large institutions that have made serious commitments to reduce their emissions, as we see those as the most likely to engage.
And thanks for that, Michael. I think while I've got you, Nick's question's a great follow-on in that it's helping to clarify one of the recommendations in the report. So Nick asks about the energy intensity mandate recommendation, and if it's another way to tackle the greenhouse gas reduction mandate, like we've seen New Zealand discussing, particularly around transport as a whole and aviation specifically.
Yeah, definitely. And I think it's a slightly different mechanism, probably one that's a little more broad than just a SAF mandate or a greenhouse gas reduction mandate. And this one probably could be rolled out much more broadly than just aviation, but it is effectively the same thing, just a slightly different framework.
Michael, what would you say on the mandate that you learned in the report from talking to stakeholders about their concerns, or some of the, I guess, the voices of opposition to mandates, perhaps relating to some of the really aggressive ones we're seeing proposed in Europe? Yeah,
I mean, ultimately, everyone, the concerns were just price. There's logistical challenges that you can overcome by being picky about where you put the liability, and that's why we chose the fuel seller as the place to put the liability rather than individual airlines. But ultimately, it is price, and even the fuel sellers and the infrastructure operators are wary that if you put something through that's going to be massively, massively expensive, you just send the airlines under, and then nobody really wins. And also from a political palatability perspective, nobody wants to get up in front of the government and basically get torn apart. So imposing huge costs or disproportionate costs was not something that people were too keen on.
Yeah, thanks, Sammy. Please jump in.
Yeah, maybe I think to build on Michael's comments, I think what I would still highlight that the regulators, even in Europe, as they have started moving forward with the mandates, I think the targets, as we are talking about them now, are still fairly modest. So So if you look at, I think in the European Commission's proposal, 2% SAF mandate in 2025, that is translating to roughly SAF demand in Europe of 1 million tons, considering that the total jet fuel consumption in Europe was something like 47 million tons before the pandemic. Or if looking at I think in the report of the Energy Link, the demand of 2.5% energy intensity mandate, around 190 kilotons of SAF when implemented. I think those are both still very modest numbers if you look at the SAF capacity that is coming on stream in the next couple of years. So Neste alone will have globally a capacity of around 1.5 million tons already next year, and I think we see quite many other industry players investing at the same time. So I think from our point of view, those targets could be higher or they could be implemented earlier. And maybe the other consideration is about the cost to the consumers. So those kind of 5% or below 5% mandate levels in a ticket price level, the impact to consumers is roughly the same as buying coffee in the airport. So it is still fairly modest at these levels. But what is really important is that the train is moving and these first steps are being taken.
Might jump in there as well, Heidi, just from an airline perspective. So, obviously, if you compare Europe to the US, there is a difference in the carrot and the stick approach. I think my observation of it in our environment and from an airline perspective is that you probably need both. Now, I know people have some coming in beliefs and philosophical beliefs around the efficacy of a mandate, but I think from an airline perspective, you limit sort of competitive distortions with a mandate, and also sends a good signal to producers in which they can underwrite their investment decisions. But I also think on the other side of the equation, direct subsidies into the producers, like what they do in California, is also important. So I would really advocate for learning from that overseas experience and taking both policy measures.
Thank you both. I think in a similar space is a question we've got here around subsidies from Alan. And Alan's question is, what proportion of the current 10 billion per annum fossil fuel subsidies applies to the jet fuels market segment? And could this be phased out over, say, a 10-year period and transferred to supporting the SAF industry development? Anyone want to jump in on that one?
I think I'm happy just to say it's a good thought. I think really, if the government gets to a position where, in my view, the strategic liquid fuels of this country going forward should be renewable diesel and SAF, then if you look, once you get past that point and you look at what other fuels are subsidised here, I think there's a pretty strong case then to say you could redirect some of the existing pots of money to a broad-based sort of sector-wide subsidy. And I think there's a really good, strong case there for it. So it's not necessarily new pots of money from the government, but just a redirection.
Yeah, I think I agree with you on that one, Graham. Anyone else from the panel want to comment on the subsidy situation or suggestion? Well, I think there's a couple of questions here around feedstocks, which I think is an interesting shift in considering the SAF opportunities in Australia. So Peter has asked a question here around expanding or he's interested in finding out if you expand on the price impact increasing feedstock for SAF. Sorry, let me rephrase this. If you expand the price impact increasing the cost of feedstocks as SAF production increases and competition for feedstocks increase, what mechanisms can we see in place for managing those increases to feedstocks, potential increase to feedstocks?
I'm happy to go first here, but I would also love Sammy's thoughts, as I feel
great.
Definitely his area. I think particularly for Australia, we're lucky that we've got a lot of different feedstock opportunities and a lot of different pathways we can leverage. You know, there are the heifer pathways that use fatty oils, alcohol pathways that you can use a lot of the sugar and kind of crop and type feedstocks, and then you've got the gasification and Fischer-Tropsch pathways where you can use biomass. So I think it is all about diversity in supply in the same way you have with traditional fuels. You don't want to get all of your oil from one spot, for example. When you're running a refinery, it's the same with feedstocks. Some level of competition is always good, I would say. Having one refinery that's the only buyer, it's probably better if you have a few, just because there is some competition to incentivize more feedstock to come into the market. But yes, trying to do the entire of Australia's SAF on one particular pathway and one particular feedstock, you would see a bit of a price increase, but I'll let Sammy elaborate.
Yeah, I think, Michael, you definitely touched on the most important aspect. So kind of continuously expanding that base of sustainable raw materials that we would use to produce sustainable aviation fuels. And then there is within that both things we can do with the feedstocks we use today, the kind of waste and residue oils and fats we can continuously improve and develop collection and aggregation of those to be able to grow the pool. Also, what we are doing on Neste's side is continuously investing in those kind of pre-treatment technologies so that we can utilize lower quality and raw materials that contain higher levels of different impurities and still use them in our refineries. So that work is important. But then it is also about going to new kinds of raw materials and technologies, taking lignocellulosic raw materials into use, municipal solid wastes, and of course ultimately power to liquids type of technologies. And these provide a lot of opportunities also for Australia. Maybe the last thing to highlight is also the importance of doing right kind of policies. So what is in these policy frameworks, what is really important is that there is a clear criteria and requirements for sustainability. Thresholds are set, for example, on the life cycle carbon emission reductions that need to be achieved with the feedstocks. But then the policies also need to leave room for innovation. So the kind of very closed list type of policies that constrain the space for innovation are not very helpful and can kind of create unnecessary competitive pressure for some particular raw materials.
I think also from an end user perspective, we're starting to see some early offers, and you can quickly determine the projects and the producers that have got a long-term feedstock play as part of their project concept. So, for an airline, it's not only the day one SAF premium that's the problem, but the pricing basis going forward and the volatility in the movement of the price as it goes through the contract. And you can see already the projects have sorted out an integrated feedstock play because they had more latitude to be creative on their pricing basis in these early days than those that have to go out to the spot market and purchase used cooking oil every year. So it's that feedstock play and the integration of that can't be underestimated because it does have a real flow on into the commercials that ultimately get presented to the airlines.
Yeah, thank you both. Actually, hopefully Daniel, that discussion answers a bit of your question. Daniel's pointed to the Jet Zero Council in the UK having identified the possibility of a heifer cap, identifying the over-reliance on heifer pathways for SAF production and the potential detrimental effect on feedstock competition and environmental impacts. And the question what he had was around the policy instruments, and is it too early to put those kind of consider those kind of policy caps or limitations in the Australian market. I don't know if anybody wants to add anything more to that. I feel like that was quite a good coverage there, Sammy and Graham, around the types of policy and it being encouraging of innovation, but also considering the feedstocks and where they come from. Celine, you've got your hand up. Did you want to jump in on that?
Yeah, I just wanted to add as well that over the medium to long term, we'll really need to also develop the synthetic fuels, which is derived mainly from electricity. And given Australia's access to cheap renewable electricity, we'll be in a very good place to develop that industry as well. So in terms of feedstock, that's another diversification, and in this case, quite there'll be a lot of it. Like there'll be potentially a lot of scope to produce a lot of synthetic fuels. There won't be as much like the fuels from bio sources. I think will be limited, and given the scale volume that we need, be important to also develop the synthetic fuels.
Thank you. Yes, Sammy, please jump in.
Yeah, very much agree on Celine's point on the power to liquid side. But just to kind of comment quickly on those kind of caps that have been in discussions in the UK. I think what I would highlight that as such the kind of competition between technologies and technology neutrality of policies is a positive thing and desired thing. So in a sense, fundamentally, rather than applying caps, policies should encourage the kind of competition and create a more level playing field and rather establish more neutral type of sustainability requirements to facilitate that kind of competition. So I think we wouldn't recommend that path. But that being said, what we also do see important from our point of view is that some forms of supply side incentives, R&D funding are definitely means that the governments could utilize to support the commercialization of that kind of technologies that have today low technology readiness levels.
Thanks, Sammy. Shahana, did you want to jump in?
I know, I'm gate crashing the panel, aren't I?
Not
rude?
at all.
I just thought it would probably be good to sort of frame this within the broader context of Australia's future bioeconomy moving forward. I think that when we think about right now feedstock availability, or we look back to the work that was done back in 2013, it was operating under the environment of what we thought the future was going to look like then. If we look at this within positioning of decarbonisation of transport more globally, electrification of the passenger vehicle market, and a range of other things, hydrogen coming into play and other things, it actually then we start to look at things like Australia's current ethanol production, and the capacity that we're currently producing in terms of ethanol, our biodiesel production, the renewable diesel plants that are coming online and the like. So I think it's, you can look at it as if we're starting from scratch with available feedstock that is sitting around now, or we can actually say in a bigger picture kind of strategic sense, as things transition, there's going to be a different market for these different pathways, because that's where the hardest to abate is going to be of most value. So I think it's, it's very easy to jump to, well, we don't have enough feedstock and it's not going to work. That's not the case. I think it's around what are the market drivers that are going to get us to the place of the feedstock going to SAF. Sorry, I'll jump out again.
No, that's fantastic context. Thank you. Really helpful, Shahana. Michael.
Yeah, and I think just kind of adding on to that and echoing to an extent Sammy's thoughts, I think markets will decide with price signals what is the best way to do things. So hard caps on specific technologies or trying to pick a technology winner is not necessarily a good thing. I think policies that set clear frameworks for markets to operate, if the cost of a Heifer feedstock went up 50 times, then the other ones look far more attractive. And that's a very extreme scenario. I'm not suggesting that's going to happen, but if you allow markets to do their thing, it's just like any other commodity. If things get too expensive, the market will look at an alternative, and then you're not restricting any kind of development around Heifer or any of the other like fatty oil fuels that you can derive from that. So I think markets have an important role to play, and I wouldn't think like codifying a cap or anything like that would be the best way to do it.
Thank you all. We have a couple of minutes left, and there's a few questions here around Australian specific circumstances. One's relating to infrastructure that I'd be interested to see if there's anyone with some thoughts on the panel. It's from an anonymous participant. It says, is reutilising existing oil refineries the most realistic initial way forward in local SAF production in Australia? Obviously pointing to the BP announcement about the Kwinana refinery refit over in Western Australia. Any thoughts on the infrastructure and I guess the best initial way forward, or where you think we might be seeing production, and if it's from those existing refineries? Michael, yeah, please jump in.
Yeah, so I mean, the BP one's well announced, and I'm sure Graham can probably talk to that at length, but ultimately it is going to come down to cost. There are still a number of refineries, particularly on the East Coast, that are operating under traditional methods, and it may be more simple to just build new ones in locations where it's best suited, because those refineries may not necessarily be closest to the feedstocks that are needed for them. So I think it really does depend on a case-by-case basis, and also how well those refineries are actually suited to handling the relevant chemical process needed for the production pathway.
Thank you. Okay, and then another one that's specific to Australia is asking whether there's any consideration of linking SAF carbon reduction to ACCUs, Australian carbon credits. Michael, did you want to jump in on that?
Yeah, definitely would love to. It's just that at the moment, the financial benefit that you would get from ACCUs and use of SAF is not sufficient to bridge the gap. But there are methods currently, and there are methods being developed to make it easier. But you can currently create ACCUs from using SAF in the aviation sector.
Great, thank you. Well, listen, we have a minute left to go, and there are a few questions that we haven't been able to get to. So I apologise to those that didn't get their questions answered, but really big thank you to all for being a very engaged audience. I would love to round out and say, what's the one thing you'd change from each of the points, from each of the participants on the call, the panel, but perhaps we can pick that up next time. I did want to take a moment to say thank you very much to the panelists, to Graham, Sammy and Celine, and of course Michael, for sharing time with us today and your thoughts on this really important report. And another big thank you to Shahana, to Loren, and to all of the Bioenergy Australia team for supporting this seminar. Thank you all. Shahana, anything from you before we wrap up and finish?
No, I just wanted to say it was fantastic, and I really love doing these really short 1 hour, punch them in, have a good chat, and then people can have their lunch, then get on with the rest of their day and feel inspired to help us accelerate SAF in Australia. So really delighted. Once again, thank you to everyone who's participated, and yes, a massive thank you to Lauren, who has done an amazing job pulling this one together. So thank you everyone, and we will distribute the recording around to everyone, and it will be available on Bioenergy Australia's YouTube channel and on our website as well.